The sun poured into Egypt's western desert like molten white iron, without pity and without pause. At noon in the summer of 1942, every grain of sand seemed to hold its own ember. Heat rose in visible waves and bent the horizon as if the world itself were melting. Rashid's fingers barely touched the Jeep's engine cover before his hand snapped back on reflex. The metal was blistering, but what struck him harder than the heat was the absence of sound. Their modified American engine had gone dead. No sputter, no shudder, no last attempt. Only the air above the radiator shimmered and hissed, thin and constant, like something trying to speak through a closed mouth. A dull split sounded from the rear. It was not loud, but in the dead noon it landed like a hammer. Sam, crouched by the wheel, jerked his head up just as their last 25-gallon auxiliary water tank opened along an old weld seam. Water sprayed out with a harsh, desperate sound and disappeared into the sand as if swallowed by a throat. A dark stain spread, then faded as it evaporated almost immediately. The air filled with a sharp, ugly smell of rust, hot rubber, and overheated paint. Sam cursed and threw himself at the tank, trying to clamp the split with his palms. The water soaked his sleeve, flashed cool for a heartbeat, then turned to heat again as it dried. The coolness had been a lie. The loss was real, and it was irreversible. Rashid did not look at the water. He climbed a low ridge of rock beside the vehicle and stared southeast, one hand braced above his eyes. Heat haze made the horizon tremble, but he saw the dust column clearly, pale yellow, narrow, and moving straight toward them. Not the broad, dirty smear of a sandstorm. This was a concentrated plume, a straight line of grit rising from hard ground. Wheels, mechanical motion, distance by instinct and long practice no more than 10 kilometers. On hard desert ground, a light detachment could cut that down fast. He judged the time the way a hunter judges closing steps, an hour at most before they were close enough to see steel. "How many vehicles?" Sam asked as he joined him, voice cracked with thirst. In one hand he still held a wet piece of metal skin he had torn from the ruptured tank, as if he could use it to patch the day. Rashid counted the faint branching at the base of the dust. 3, maybe 4, light and fast. His tone roughened. Not armor. Recon, Afrika Korps. Sam's face drained. Heavy armor bogged down out here, slow and loud. Light scouts did not. They were hunting dogs, and the stranded LRDG Jeep was a piece of meat that could not run. The radio! Sam slid down the rock and lunged for the British wireless set number. 19 bolts were bolted beside the driver's seat. The panel lamps were dead. He spun the tuning dial until his fingers hurt, slapped the casing, leaned in as if sound might leak from it by force, and got nothing but a hollow thud. Road shock, grit, and heat had finished it. He yanked a tool roll from his pocket and started pulling bolts, hands trembling from urgency and the first bite of dehydration. If the oscillator's intact, if the coils— "Stop," Rashid said. The word was calm, almost flat, and that calm made it feel cruel. Rashid dragged out the canvas water bags, less than half left, and checked the stoppers with quick, practiced hands, as if the world still followed rules. "It's our only hope," Sam snapped, eyes bloodshot. "If we can put out a carrier, headquarters might triangulate, even a bare signal, even a fragment. Triangulation takes time." Rashid tilted his head toward the dust. "They do not need time. They need only to keep moving until they see us." He moved fast. He sorted what mattered, not what regulations said mattered. Food enough for days became food for hours. Hard biscuits and tins of meat, a first aid kit, 2 Lee Enfield rifles with limited ammunition, knives, a heavy tarp, the navigation kit, a sun compass and a magnetic compass. Then he opened the radio casing Sam had loosened and tore out only a handful of parts. The oscillator, a coil, and 2 heavy dry batteries. He did it without hesitation, stripping the dead set the way a man strips a corpse for anything that can still walk. "Those come with us," he said. "Everything else stays." Sam started to argue. Rashid seized his tunic, the grip stealing Sam's breath, and held his gaze. Rashid's eyes were amber and steady under the sun, the look of a man who had watched people die of thirst and learned to measure life in minutes. "The vehicle is dead," Rashid said. "The water is going. They are coming. Do you want to die holding an iron coffin, or do you want to live?" He released him and pointed northwest toward dunes and jagged rock. "That country breaks vehicles. It does not break legs. For them it is hell. For us it is the only road." Sam looked at the dust, then at the thin bundles on the sand. Discipline said protect equipment, wait for rescue, trust the map and the net of friendly patrols. Survival said move now, before the enemy could see the shape of the trap. Fear clenched his chest, but he nodded because there was no other answer that did not end on its knees. "How do we navigate?" he managed, hating the weakness in his voice. "The sun will fall," Rashid said. "Then the stars come. Our compass is above us." His voice left no room for debate. "Help!" They worked in hard, fast silence. With tarp and sand they dulled the jeep's outline and buried the shine of metal and glass. Rashid brushed away obvious tracks near the vehicle, especially the marks that would point toward their true line of departure. Then he took pains to make the wrong direction look plausible. A cleaner edge, fewer scuffs, a suggestion of movement that ended in confusion. Under his direction, Sam scuffed false trails to the east and south as if men had stumbled off in panic and split. He left an empty canteen cover marked LRDG where a careful searcher would find it and feel certain he had found the story's beginning. When the sun tilted west and the heat lost the sharpest edge of its bite, they left the steel carcass and walked northwest. On hard gravel their steps barely showed. On mixed sand and stone the prints deepened. Rashid led with an odd rhythm, shifting from hard patches to darker crusts of salt where wind could erase marks quickly. He showed Sam how to tie a strip of tarp to his heel and drag it like a broom to smear the sharper prints. The crust cracked underfoot, brittle and loud, but the impressions stayed shallow and broke into irregular fragments. Sam's breathing turned harsh and dry. Hot air scraped his lungs, and when he swallowed, he tasted blood. He looked back once. Their route was already less obvious on the mottled ground, but the dust plume behind them looked clearer, not weaker. The hunters were still coming, and the distance between them was not a comfort, only a measurement. Night fell as if someone had shut a door. Heat vanished, replaced by cold that cut through clothing and made joints ache. The sky opened in sharp clarity. The Milky Way lay across it like a bright band of dust, and the stars were bright enough to feel close. Rashid stood still and read them. He found Orion's belt, traced its line to Sirius, then moved north to Polaris. He did not speak, but Sam could feel him measuring angles and drawing invisible lines. Rashid checked the magnetic compass and shook his head. The local variation was large, and hidden mineral seams could twist a needle into lies. "Trust the dunes more than the needle," he murmured, and pointed toward a gap between two great sand hills where a darker corridor led deeper into the night. They walked by starlight. It was torment and cover. Rashid chose pale hard patches, salt flats, old lake beds, gravel bands, wind-polished ground, where prints stayed shallow or vanished. He avoided darker sand that looked smooth but gave underfoot like a trap. Sometimes a faint engine hum drifted on the wind, left then right, as if the enemy were sweeping broad arcs rather than following one line. Rashid changed direction in short, purposeless zigzags, then eased back toward their true heading. "Let the trackers guess," he said, and his voice was as steady as the stars. Once they had to cross open sand. Rashid scratched a chaotic set of marks forward and off to one side, like someone falling and crawling. Then, as they left on their real line, he dragged the tarp over the last section, blending their trail into the false endpoint until it became hard to read, a smudge that could mean anything. Before dawn, they folded into a fissure in a rock wall. Sam fell into half-sleep, the kind that is more collapse than rest. Rashid stayed upright, robe tight, listening. Wind carried a faint vibration from the east, not a close engine, more like distant movement over hard crust, boots cracking salt, metal tapping against metal. The search was not behind them. It was parallel. Rashid's brow tightened. The hunters were sweeping wide, trying to encircle, predicting rather than chasing. They were waiting for thirst and fatigue to make the mistake for them. He woke Sam and allowed him a single small sip from the water bag, the smallest mercy he could afford. "They didn't buy it," Sam whispered. "They changed tactics," Rashid said, watching the pale edge of the horizon where dunes rose like a spine. "So do we." Daylight returned with cruel speed, as if the sun had been held behind a lid and now was thrown open. The temperature climbed fast and hard. They crossed a flat expanse of gravel with no landmarks, the stones reflecting a blinding monotone. Heat shimmer turned distance into mirage and made every direction look the same. Sam's mouth split and bled. His lips peeled. The water bag grew lighter with every rationed mouthful. Rashid rationed by minutes and by breath, enough to wet the throat, never enough to satisfy. Their walking became mechanical, boots rasping on gravel, hearts hammering in a silence broken only by wind. By midday, Sam's stride faltered. A sharp headache drove into his temples like a wedge. Darkness flickered at the edges of his vision and nausea rose. He stopped and retched, empty, and the effort made the world tilt. Rashid was on him at once, hand to Sam's burning forehead and salt-crusted neck. "Heat exhaustion coming," Rashid said, calm and practical. There was no shade. Rashid scraped a shallow pit in the lee of a low rock where the sand beneath was slightly cooler. He dampened both headscarves with the smallest possible measure of water, laid one under Sam, folded the other across his forehead and eyes, and rigged a tiny tarp shade low to the ground. It did not block the sun's assault, but it made a pocket of moving air, and in the desert that could be the difference between stumbling and dying. "Do not move," he ordered. "Breathe. Find the wind. Let it carry heat away." Time crawled. Sam felt the damp cloth under his back and the thin coolness it offered. The ringing in his ears eased and his vision steadied. He listened to his own breathing and the faintest flow of air under the tarp. Rashid stayed crouched nearby, scanning the empty line where sky met gravel, listening more than looking, as if a sound might reveal what the horizon refused to show. "Where are they?" Sam asked, voice thin. "Left, right," Rashid said. "Engines, not behind. They circle like hands, closing." He showed the arc with his palms, closing slowly. "They expect us to run toward roads or water on the northwest edge. They wait there, then squeeze." Despair settled heavy. Their running had not freed them. It had drawn a better net. Vehicles could sweep wide and slow. Men on foot could not. "What do we do?" Sam asked. Rashid finally looked at him. The gaze held no surrender. "We teach them to look down again," he said. "We teach them to waste time." By late afternoon, Sam could walk. They moved slower, and Rashid began choosing ground for deception as much as for speed. Before dusk, they reached a dry riverbed, a wadi, deep cut with steep banks and branching channels. Dead shrubs lay like bones. Wind funneled through it with a hint of cool. The junctions and split channels made a natural maze. "Here," Rashid said at a triangular meeting of channels. "Soon it will be cold, very cold." He gathered every reflective object they had, the canteen caps, scrap metal, an empty tin, brass casings, and several polished black stone chips he carried. He had Sam dig a dozen shallow pits along the stony floor near the junction, placing them where a patrol moving through would expect footsteps and dropped gear. In each pit, Rashid set a different piece at a careful angle, then covered the edges so only small reflective surfaces remained, tilted toward the main approach. He scattered a few snapped twigs and a small pile of stones, too subtle to be obvious, but enough to suggest recent human hands. "At night they cool fast," Rashid said, explaining as if the desert were a classroom. "A thin film of moisture forms. Under flares or a searchlight they shine wrong. Wet, they will think it is equipment or a lens or someone hiding. They will stop, argue and search." They withdrew to a higher hollow with a view of the junction and waited in the cold, wrapped in tarp, to hide their outline and their body heat. Hours later a flare rose in the east, then another, the search pattern creeping north in careful squares. The wadi remained dark until a harsh beam cut in from the entrance, a searchlight from a light scout vehicle. It swept the stones, paused, swept again, and stopped on one of Rashid's pits. A sliver of metal gleamed with a cold halo. A fresh flare turned the junction white, and more false glints appeared, brass giving a reddish flash, black stone edges throwing sharp points of light, the bent tin rim catching a thin silver line. Engines halted outside. German commands carried down, short and clipped. 6 infantry entered the wadi in a cautious line, rifles ready, flashlights bobbing. They moved slowly, checking every suspicious reflection. They crouched, turned stones, and cursed when they found only junk. Yet they could not ignore a cluster of anomalies. In this country, one mistake could be fatal, and thoroughness became a trap they set for themselves. Every pit suggested the next pit might hide something real. From the bank, Rashid counted them and listened to their spacing. He watched how often they looked back toward the vehicles, how tight the formation stayed, how long the officer at the entrance held his light on one pit before deciding it demanded boots on the ground. Rashid's eyes were not triumphant, they were calculating. The time it would take to clear the junction, the patience of the commander, the line between caution and irritation. If irritation won, the Germans might rush. If caution won, they would keep digging for certainty that did not exist. Sam felt a trembling mixture of relief and absurdity. They were hiding above a stage lit by enemy flares, and their props were scraps of metal and cold stone. It worked because it made the enemy doubt what his eyes told him. Doubt made men slow, and slowness bought life. When a flare guttered and darkness briefly returned, Rashid touched Sam's shoulder. "Move," he said. They slipped away through a narrow crack upstream and vanished into the open night. Behind them, the Germans continued to search, and the search continued to cost them time. Later, sheltered under rock, Sam laid out the salvaged radio parts. Rashid watched him and asked, "Can you make it speak again, but not like a man begging?" Sam understood. "A distress call is obvious," he said. "A steady carrier, a known Morse pattern. Easy to recognize, easy to ignore or jam. But if it is weak and intermittent, like a damaged set, maybe an operator trying to hold a coded link, then it becomes a problem they have to solve." He thought through the limits. Short bursts, random incomplete groups. Enough to make them stop and listen. Enough to make them take out a direction finder, argue what it means, and waste minutes calling for guidance. "If they can hear it," Rashid said. "They might," Sam replied, "if their scouts are monitoring and close enough. The desert is quiet on the dial. Weak signals stand out." "Make them guess," Rashid said. "Make them waste time measuring it." Sam built the device with what he had. He scraped insulation from wire ends with the knife tip and wired the coil to the oscillator. He kept the load low to protect the parts and the batteries, and he used a short strip of metal from his pack frame as a crude antenna. Nothing about it was efficient, and that was useful. The signal needed to sound sick. He exploited the oscillator's instability to produce a wavering carrier. For the message, he tapped the circuit by hand, practicing meaningless point-and-dash fragments until his fingers could keep a pattern without thought. When he tested it, the coil gave off a thin whine, and the carrier wavered as if fevered. "It works," he said at last, tired and quietly pleased. "We can make it complain for a day if we are careful. We transmit in intervals and do not burn the coil." He sketched the rhythm in the sand with a fingertip. A short transmission, a longer silence, then another burst from a slightly different place. "If they have a direction finder, they'll chase bearings that never settle. If they don't, the signal still gnaws at them. Men hate a mystery they can almost touch." Rashid wrapped it with care. "Tomorrow we let it sing at a place that hurts vehicles," he said. "We pull them where they cannot run." On the third day they pushed northwest by north toward the edge of the Great Sand Sea. The dunes ahead felt heavier, the air drier, as if the land itself had thickened. Rashid slowed and began reading sand as much as sky. He crouched often, lifted handfuls, felt grain size and dryness, and studied the ripples that wind carved across the surface. He taught Sam to follow firmer ridges, long wind-polished crests locals called whalebacks, and to avoid the darker troughs between them where fine sand gathered loose and hungry. "Step where I step," Rashid said, "not 1 inch off." By afternoon, they reached a junction where several ridges met. One path stayed on a firm crest, relatively straight. Another sloped into a flat-looking basin dotted with dead camel thorn. Wind eddies over the basin lifted the finest dust, a sign the surface was constantly being skimmed away. Rashid watched it once, then nodded. "Here!" He took larger scraps of metal from the jeep and half buried them at the start of the slope into the basin, angled as if shaken loose from a moving vehicle. With his boots, he scuffed a few short, messy marks at the boundary of firm and soft sand, like wheels slipping and turning, and blended the ends into natural wind ripples. Then he used the tarp strip to smear their own prints for the first stretch along the firm ridge route, blurring direction at the decision point. "Now," Rashid said, "make the ghost sing toward the basin." Sam crouched in a sheltered hollow, connected the batteries, and aimed the irregular antenna toward the soft troughs. He transmitted in the pattern he had practiced, 15 seconds on, minutes off, then a shorter burst with quick random taps between. The signal was weak, but on a clean desert band it was enough to be caught nearby by anyone listening and turning the dial. It sounded like a set dying slowly, unwilling to go quiet. They waited. A dust column appeared to the southeast, moving fast. 3 vehicles, as Rashid had judged, a light scout car with an antenna, an open-top utility vehicle, and a loaded truck. They slowed as they reached the ridge junction. An officer stepped out with binoculars. Sam pictured the radio operator inside the scout car, hands tight on a dial, trying to steady the wavering signal and take a bearing the line would point toward the basin. The officer argued with his men, pointing between the firm ridge and the basin. The choice was simple on paper and deadly in sand. Finally, he made it and waved them down the slope. For a few dozen meters, the vehicles moved. Then the truck's wheels spun and began to sink, the engine note climbing while the vehicle barely advanced. The open-top vehicle tried to swing wide and dropped a wheel deep, its chassis settling as if someone had cut its legs. The scout car reversed too late and bogged as the sand softened under it. The 3 machines became trapped insects, engines howling, wheels digging them deeper. The truck's rear axle sank until the differential kissed sand, and each attempt to power out only spun the wheels faster, polishing a bowl that swallowed them. Men shoved at fenders, laid scrap under tires, and pulled on ropes until their shoulders bowed, but the sand flowed back the moment they cleared it. The scout car tried to tow the truck and only buried itself more. Every engine note climbed into strain and then dropped into the dull cough of a motor fighting a load it could not lift. Rashid lowered the binoculars. His face stayed flat. "Go," he said. They continued along the firm ridge without looking back. The hunters had lost their speed. Even if the Germans freed one vehicle, it would cost time, fuel, and nerve, and in the desert, those were as valuable as water. By sunset, they reached wind-carved rock pillars rising at the sand sea's edge, tall and jagged like grave markers. Between them ran narrow corridors and deep gullies. Moonlight would turn those corridors into knives of light and blackness, and sound would bounce until direction became guesswork. Rashid found a nearly invisible crack at the base of a wall where the sand beneath was darker and faintly damp. They pressed cloth to it, drawing out only enough moisture to wet cracked lips. Miserly mercy, but it kept them from cracking. They chewed the last hard biscuit and listened to the wind moan through stone. That night, Rashid heard what the wind could not hide, the thin whine of light motorcycle engines, more than one, probing the pillars from the southeast. The German commander had not quit. He had changed tools, splitting off men who could thread rock where vehicles could not. Sam tightened his grip on the rifle. Rashid shook his head. Gunfire pins us. One shot and they know exactly where to aim. In this place, the rocks give us better weapons. He split their last demolition charge into 2 small portions and gave one to Sam. Then he sent Sam climbing to a hidden hollow partway up the tallest pillar with the ghost transmitter. "Wait for my whistle," Rashid said. "Transmit 1 minute, then stop and move. Never from the same place twice. After you shut it off, count 30 seconds and throw your charge east far. The echoes will do the rest. Rashid disappeared into the pillar's shadows with the second charge and a pocketful of stones. Moonlight turned the maze into pale stone and black void. The motorcycles entered the outer corridors and stopped and started, cautious. German voices carried in clipped bursts, close one moment, distant the next, because the rock bent sound. A search like this had to be careful. In a maze, speed was how you broke your own neck. Rashid's whistle snapped through the dark, echoing off rock. Sam switched on the ghost set. The wavering carrier and broken Morse taps spilled from above. The engines below went silent. For a breath, the maze held only wind. Then a flashlight beam jerked upward, trying to find the source, and another beam cut across a different wall, as if a second man had heard something else. Sam shut the set down at the count, shifted to a new notch, and hurled his charge into an eastern passage. The blast was sharp, and the rock maze stretched it into rolling thunder that made direction hard to judge. A heartbeat later, Rashid detonated his own charge to the west. The second echo chain collided with the first and turned the pillars into a confusion of sound. The motorcycles roared again, now with hesitation. Flashlights swept wildly, shouts rose, tense and angry. Men tried to map sound with instinct and failed. The Germans could not decide where the target was or whether the whole maze had been prepared for them. Rashid made the maze lie. He moved in the shadows, showing a brief silhouette on a ridge, then vanishing. He threw stones to make sharp taps that sounded like movement or gear striking rock. Echoes twisted every clue. When a flashlight caught empty stone, Rashid was already somewhere else. One motorcycle trooper drifted inward toward a circular pocket of rock where moonlight barely reached. The walls were smooth, the shadows deep. He stopped, rifle up, breathing hard, turning his head as if he could catch the truth by listening. Rashid stepped out from a narrow fissure 5 meters away, hands empty. In rough but clear German, he said, "Do you have enough water to last until sunrise? In this stone maze, does your compass still point north?" The trooper froze. The words hit deeper than threat. Out here, water and direction were life, and an enemy naming them in your own language made the world tilt. His eyes flicked to his canteen, then to the compass at his chest, then back as he tried to see Rashid's face. Rashid flung a handful of fine, dry sand into the man's eyes. The trooper cried out and flinched, and in that blink, Rashid closed distance. He struck the man's wrist with the solid handle of his knife and knocked the rifle away. With his other hand, he tore the canteen from the belt and the compass from the man's chest. He did not linger to kill. He slipped back into shadow as if swallowed by it. He left only a low sentence behind him, still in German. "The wind comes from the northeast. Follow the sharp corners of the shadows and you can get out." When Rashid and Sam met again at their planned point, the motorcycle engines still buzzed through the maze, frantic and directionless. There were curses and a few blind rifle shots, but no organized push. The ghost ambush had not needed bodies. It had broken confidence, and in the desert, confidence was a fuel. Before dawn on the 5th day, they reached the final map coordinates behind a wind-sheltered dune. Sam placed a small mirror and a larger piece of chrome from the Jeep's instrument panel at a set angle toward the brightening east, an lrdg ground recognition signal simple enough to survive exhaustion. Then they buried themselves in sand for warmth and waited. Cold pressed in. Sam's thoughts drifted, catching on the smallest sounds, then slipping away. As the cold gnawed at his last resolve, Rashid's hand closed on his arm. 2 black dots moved on the horizon. They grew into vehicles. 2 modified Chevrolet lrdg trucks, machine guns mounted on the roof racks, coming straight toward the dune. Sam forced himself upright and flashed the mirror in a steady rhythm. The trucks accelerated, dust sharp in the new light. They braked hard in front of them. Familiar English shouts rang out. Hands hauled them aboard. Someone shoved a water bottle into Sam's hands, and the first swallow felt like being pulled back into the world. He did not realize how close he had been to letting go until the water proved he was still here. Before climbing in, Rashid turned once toward the desert they had crossed. To the patrol leader, a lean New Zealander with sharp eyes, he said evenly, "Southeast, edge of the Great Sand Sea, rock pillars, 4 to 6 German scouts. Their vehicles are stuck in soft sand. Their motorcycles may be out of fuel or lost. They will need water and tow rope. The leader held Rashid's gaze for a beat, then nodded and began issuing quick orders without asking for a story. In this unit, facts mattered more than drama. In the jolting truck bed wrapped in blankets, Sam watched Rashid across the scattered radio parts and the crude ghost set. The patrol leader leaned back from the cab and offered Sam a cigarette. Then he looked at Rashid. Curiosity finally won. "How did you two last that long, and you even turned it on them?" Sam tried to explain stars and salt crust and temperature and radio noise, the way Rashid read ground like a map, and the way a weak signal could become a trap. Words failed. He finally touched his own temple, then pointed at Rashid. "He hears what the desert is saying. I learned how to make noise speak in its language." The leader's eyes lingered on the knot of wires. "Turning a distress call into deception," he murmured, "turning escape into a trap." Then he addressed Rashid. "When we get back, you need to talk to our navigators and signalers. Not a report, a lesson." Rashid drank a mouthful of water and looked out at the dunes sliding past, the land already returning to silence behind them. Dawn laid a thin, gold-red glaze on the cold world, brief and sharp. "The desert's rule is simple," he said. "It does not help the men with more guns. It helps the men who can hear it. Today we heard it. Tomorrow it may be someone else." He paused, voice steady. "Or they learn to listen." The trucks roared on toward the oasis post, leaving the great sand sea behind. The deserts stayed silent, but the knowledge of stars, wind, cold, and echoes moved with them, harder to break than steel, and shared between two men who had learned for a few days to trust the same rules.